When Turner refused Vince, Vince did not give up, but instead came directly to the owners. Most wrestling fans know that Jim Barnett struck a deal with Vince with the approval of Jack and Jerry Briscoe, who were co-owners of the territory. On both Dark Side of the Ring and when Jerry Briscoe was a guest on my podcast with Jake the Snake Pit, Jerry stated that one of the deciding factors for him and Jack to sell was that they had not received any of their dividend money from the company. And the heat for that was on Ole Anderson, the other owner of the company who is in control of the revenue. So, Ted, I mean, there's a lot going on behind the scenes and a lot of resentment between all of the people who are in power with Georgia. Did you hear any of the rumblings of this, or are you just going to work and doing your job, staying the hell out of it?
I was just going to work, doing my job.
That's smart business on your part. Was there any indication that the Briscoes and Barnett were unhappy with Ole and the way he was running day-to-day operations?
You know, if they were, of course, I wouldn't see any of that. You know, man, I remember them. They came into Atlanta one time, and actually, they both stayed at my apartment.
Really?
Jack and Jerry, yeah. But I don't know. I don't remember.
Well, let's get to the big day. It's July 14th, 1984. Vince is at TV and makes it publicly known that the WWF will now be broadcast on the Superstation time slot. Ted, this is one of the craziest moments in all of wrestling. Vince McMahon all of a sudden is appearing on Georgia TV, and it's not Gordon Soley out there with him. He's got Freddie Miller out there as his announcer for the voice of Georgia. So, like, I mean, right out of the gate, he's getting heat with fans because all these people tuned in to see Georgia Championship Wrestling, and now Vince McMahon is there, and he's saying, "Hey, check out what we're doing up there in New York." When did it become public knowledge for talent and employees that Vince had purchased this time slot? Like, did you find out day of?
Oh, shoot, I didn't know. Nobody would have known that until it happened. And even after it happened, and you're watching it, you're going, okay, who's in control?
I mean, absolutely bonkers for something like this to happen. Imagine watching AEW TV and all of a sudden Triple H is on there and he's saying like, "Hey, here's some WWF stuff." Like it's crazy.
Yeah.
How did you react to the situation?
It didn't bother me.
You were okay with it?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't going to. It wasn't going to turn over my wagon. You had
that deal in Japan. You were set.
I had a deal in Japan.
On the day of, Vince McMahon is here at WTBS studio. Were you at the studio that day?
I don't recall.
I was going to say, maybe you had an opportunity to interact with Vince during that time. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that it was a pretty hectic time. There's a great story out there concerning what Ole had to say to Vince and Linda McMahon on that day. Are you familiar with it? Apparently, Vince had come up to Ole, and, for perspective, Ole wasn't in on this at all. The Briscoes kind of, quote unquote, went behind his back, but in reality, the Briscoes were frustrated and just trying to do what was right for their family. So all of a sudden, Vince is there, and I think Ole's taken by surprise. And Vince comes up to him and he says, "Ole, it's good to see you. This is my wife, Linda." And Ole apparently said, "Vince, go fuck yourself, and Linda, go fuck yourself too."
I never heard
that. That's straight from Ole Anderson's son on Dark Side of the Ring. That's apparently the story that's been going around. So Ole, a little bit prickly, huh?
Yeah.
Well, fans from Georgia would spit this up because it wasn't the wrestling they had grown up and become used to over the years. And Vince would end up selling the time slot for $1 million, and we'd use that money to go and fund WrestleMania 1. So, man, it's crazy. Vince buys this time slot, but you've got to put a lot of respect on him for having the business savvy. He gets the time slot, pulls out of it, and then uses it to completely launch the WWE.
Okay, yeah, that's the other thing. I've always said this. Vince, it sounds crazy to say this. Vince doesn't really know that much or understand that much about wrestling. What Vince is an unbelievable marketer. he knew how to take wrestling and market it like nobody else could.
Hmm.
I mean, if anybody else had his savvy and understanding, you think those promoters wouldn't have done just exactly what Vince did? Sure, they would have. They all would have, but they didn't because they didn't have the savvy.
Or the foresight. I don't think anybody was predicting the future the way that Vince McMahon was and saying, like, hey, if wrestling's going to keep going and if I'm going to make as much money as humanly possible in wrestling, this is what I have to do. And again, a lot of people today might resent it, but I would be willing to guess that a lot of those people also buy WrestleMania every year whenever it comes out.
Yeah.
And without Vince McMahon, you're not seeing it.
The other thing I realized is being one of the workers is like, when he started this thing, he'd say, okay, Georgia Championship Wrestling is now part of Vince's deal. And what I also understood is that, I might be in the eyes of a lot of people, a top hand, but I understood that at that time he had the guys that he was going to go with.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? That we're going to, that, you might be coming on board, but I think he had already cherry picked the guys that were going to be his main eventers, and I said, I think I said, I'll go back to work for Bill.
So you didn't feel that New York would have been ready for Ted DiBiase in 1984? Like you would have probably been relegated to mid card despite your status.
Well, just knowing wrestling, it's like, okay, Vince knew who he was going to go with when he started this thing, and I said, it might be better for me, to let the first wave go and come at another time. When it first started, I grew up in the old school. This is the way wrestling, and I figured it was always going to be the same way. But you know what? It's not. And by the grace of God, I made the right choices.
Ted, your positioning in all this is wild, where it's like you didn't go with Vince right away. You'd end up going back to Bill Watts. You're doing stuff in Japan. And then at the exact right moment, you did come to the WWF with a gimmick that has you in stretch limousines and 5-star hotels and getting a stipend. Honestly, just beautifully played on your
part. Unbelievable. Oh my gosh.
You wouldn't have had it if you went with him in 1984.
I wouldn't have had that.